Hello and welcome to our fourth DILAX Tech Talk. My name is Meliton, and I'll be hosting again the episode for today. As a reminder and introduction for those of you who are unfamiliar with our content, we are a webinar series that's focused on APC systems, automatic passenger counting. In previous episodes, we've discussed everything from the hardware side of things all the way to the software that does the actual analytics and converts data into knowledge. So if you're interested in that, we'll link the videos in the description at the end of this video, and you can go check that out if you're more interested in automatic passenger counting technologies. Today, our focus will be a little bit different. We'll be talking about a topic that's very relevant to agencies today, which is NTD reporting. It's a complicated topic for those of you who may be familiar with it, and it's one that is very relevant to agencies. And so that's why we brought in a very special guest with us that's an expert in this field, Dr. Chu. So with me today is Dr. Chu. He's a qualified statistician and consultant for NTD certification, who has worked for many years in the Center of Urban Transportation Research at the University of South Florida. Aside from helping agencies certify their NTD reporting, Dr. Chu is developed the NTD sampling manual as well. So he has a ton of experience. He has over 20 years of experience working with agencies all across the country. And he is one of the leading experts for designing and certifying methodologies for sample, collect, process, and reporting for service consumed data to the Federal Transit Administration, the FTA, for their NTD purposes. So we have a ton of extensive knowledge today. I'm actually very excited to have Dr. Chu with us. It's going to be an exciting talk about NTD. So right before we get into it, I just want to give a quick background for those who may be unfamiliar with NTD. It stands for National Transit Database, and it's been a reporting method that's been kind of active and required for agencies since 1974. It kind of records financial, operating, asset conditions for transit systems. So a lot of different metrics that support all the way from the local to the federal level in making decisions on the data that's being recorded and how the actual transit systems are flowing. So you can use that data for multi-year comparisons, and the right people, the decision makers, can then make the right decisions based on accurate and informative data. So it's been around for over 50 years, so you can imagine there is a ton of data out there, and the right people with the right minds can essentially convert that data into real insights. And so that's why we brought in Dr. Chu to be able to discuss some of the exciting aspects of it, and some of the nitty-gritty details of actually being able to utilize your data for these purposes. So without further ado, let's jump into the first question, Dr. Chu. So as I mentioned in the introduction, you've worked with agencies for NTD reporting purposes. So I just want to kind of start with a general question that talks about what that looks like. So at what capacity have you kind of worked with agencies in the past?
Yes. You mentioned NTD for the Federal Transit Administration, and in terms of what agencies need to report, passenger boardings monthly, and both passenger boardings and the passenger miles annually to the NTD. And for these agencies, they may use different sources of data and different methods to convert those data into what they need to report to NTD in terms of monthly and annual passenger boardings and the passenger miles data. Now, one increasingly popular source of data for such purpose is an APC system. And the triple level valid APC data that after the raw APC counts have been processed. So that's increasingly popular among agencies. And there are also three potential methods that agencies may use their APC data for NTD reporting. Now, in terms of what I do in relation to NTD reporting with APC data, I play kind of two roles in respect to that. My primary role actually is to serve as a qualified statistician. You already mentioned briefly earlier. For agencies who want to use two of those three potential methods when they do NTD reporting with their APC data. One method involves statistic sampling, kind of according to a pre-established sampling plan. This is very similar to what agencies have been doing for years, but with manual ride checking. So instead of assigning people to sample the vehicle trips for manual ride checking traditionally, this method now basically assigns APC equipped vehicles to sample the trips for automated ride checking by the APC units. However, this method really only makes statistical sense when the APC system has a very low coverage of the fleet. Otherwise, you will be wasting tons of valid APC data if you limit yourself to statistic sampling and using a very tiny portion of the available data. Now, the other method that I'm involved in basically takes all available valid APC data from your APC system and expand that to generate what you need to report to NTD. Now, there is one qualification is that for this method, the valid APC data comes from 98% or less of all operated vehicle trips. So you have less than 2% of your vehicle trips not providing valid APC data, or more than at least 2% of your vehicle trips that are not providing valid APC, then this method is what you will typically use instead of using the sampling approach because you'll be wasting data. Now, this method of using all available data does not require you have 100% APC coverage. However, when the APC coverage is low, this method also need to consider how the vehicle APC vehicles should be rotated across your service.
Gotcha.
Right. Otherwise, you will be missing a lot of your data. In general, this method is widely used, widely applicable, and widely used by agencies. Now, FTA requires agencies to have either the sampling method, as mentioned earlier, or this method of using all available valid APC data to be certified by a qualified statistician before the agencies can use each method for NTD reporting. So in the case of the method of using all available APC data, FTA is really concerned that the APC-derived boardings and the passenger miles data can be biased because of non-randomness in two sources. One source is in how the APC-equipped vehicles are rotated when APC coverage is low. Kind of relate to what I mentioned earlier. The other source of potential bias is the patterns of APC-equipped trips that don't provide valid APC data that can be used for NTD reporting. So these are the two sources that potentially can generate bias in the APC-derived boardings and passenger miles for NTD reporting if the APC data are not used carefully. So that's why FTA wants a method to be certified, kind of developed, certified by a qualified statistician before such data are expanded for NTD reporting.
And so, Dr. Chu, if I can interrupt you, just to kind of recap what you're saying, with method certification, that's essentially where you come in. When you're actually certifying the method in which you're quantifying the data. Prior to that, we'll kind of get into that in a bit, but I just wanted to make sure that was clear.
Yes, so my role for this method of using all available valid APC data is to understand the unique conditions of an agency, both currently and in the future, and to develop and certify an expansion method, I call it, according to the conditions you learn for the agency. So you to have this method developed so that agency can implement it to their data and for NTD reporting. Now, my secondary role beyond these statistical methods and the certification, my secondary role in respect to with respect to APC data for NTD reporting is to help agencies better meet all FTA requirements when they try to get their APC data validated against manual data, which is part of the triennial APC system certification process. Now, FTA is concerned that errors in the triple level valid APC data from APC systems, there are potential two sources for such data in the processed APC data. One is the error in the raw counts from the APC systems. Another source of error is in the processing, when the raw data processed, they kind of generate additional errors. So they're concerned about the magnitude of these such errors in the valid APES data to be used for NTD reporting. So to control the magnitude of such errors, FTA requires the magnitude of these errors to be less than 5% through the triennial certification process. Yeah, so these are the two kind of main roles that I play in relation to using APC data for NTD reporting for agencies. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, no. And so that's great insight. I kind of want to now dive into the differences that you've obviously worked in with a ton of different agencies across the country, small and big. So I guess my next question is, what are the differences in your approach? Because obviously, the bigger the agency, I'm sure the more complex the actual expansion method is. So what are the differences you've noticed, and kind of if you can speak more to what the size of the fleet matters?
Sure. Now, well, in terms of defining large and small agencies, we may define them in two ways. One is a definition kind of for NTD, which is reduce the reporters as small agencies and the full reporters as large agencies. Now, for reduced reporters, they are only required to report annual total passenger boardings. That's it. In terms of passenger usage, okay, in terms of usage, they are only required to report passenger boardings annually, just annually, no monthly boardings, no passenger miles. Now, for full reporters, they not only need to report annual passenger boardings, but also monthly boardings and annual passenger miles. Gotcha. So that's one difference in terms of between reduced and full reporters. Furthermore, reduced reporters, I think they should think very hard about whether it's worthwhile. What's the extra burden to use APC data for NTD reporting? Because they only need to report annual total passenger boardings, okay? Because it might be much easier for them to use just the existing fare box data accounts to report annual total boardings to NTD. Now, relative to using fare box counts data, there are at least 4 aspects of extra burden in using APC data for NTD reporting for those cases, for those reduced reporters.
Reduced, yeah.
Yeah, for reduced reporters, okay? Now, one is that you need to expand. Of course, remember we mentioned earlier, they need to expand all available valid APC data. There can be a lot of data that the agency is now used to deal with, okay? So that's one thing. They need to have an expansion method I mentioned earlier. They need to develop and certify by a qualified statistician. That's extra expensive potential for them. they need to count all operator trips because you need the actual operations to expand the available data. Okay, so you need a count of all operator trips to expand the available APC data. And lastly, you need to have your APC system certified by FTA every 3 years. So all these 4 extra burdens that you must do in order to use APC data for NTD reporting, just for annual total boardings, while you can use your farebox counts for that purpose.
So it sounds like, the smaller the agency, probably the less incentive there is to use that APC data for NTD reporting, right? The bigger the agency gets, obviously it makes more sense to use that APC data than to convert it into, because it's a larger agency, there's a lot more data being flown, so it's easier to automate that process, at least in the data collection side.
Yeah, it's more cost effective to automate things for
Right.
large agencies.
Right.
Now, I'm not saying that APC systems are not used for local purposes, okay? For local
Sure.
agency purposes, they can still use the vast amount of data for planning, for operations purposes, and for performance measurement, like on-time, measurement, things like that. But for NTD reporting, they really should think hard before they, do that. Now, for full reporters, they should all think about whether or not they should go ahead with use their APC data for NTD reporting if their APC system is not certified by FTA for reporting passenger miles. Because in that scenario, they still need to go through the traditional sampling process to estimate passenger miles. Furthermore, without using APC data, their farebox counts of ridership or passenger boarding is considered as a 100% counts for NTD reporting. As a result, the sample size for estimating passenger miles is typically much lower because you are reporting 100% boardings and your sample data is only used to estimate average passenger trip lengths. So as a result, the sample size in general is much lower if you need to estimate passenger miles directly, okay, instead of through average passenger trip lengths. Now, if you are going to use your APC data for reporting passenger boardings, okay, that boardings, the annual total boardings from your APC data may not be reportable as 100% to NTD. Most likely, unless you only miss less than 2% of your operated trips not having valid APC data for NTD reporting. That's very difficult to achieve.
Right.
So as a result, in that scenario, allowed to report passenger boardings, but not passenger miles by your APC system, think hard before you do that. You might as well continue what you have been doing while improve your APC system so that it can generate good data for passenger miles and get the system certified by FTA for reporting passenger miles.
So I kind of want to shift the topic kind of back to that comparison of smaller, bigger agencies. Obviously, the data side that is useful for an agency, it can vary. From a small agency to a large agency, it might be good to understand the passenger flow. But again, this conversation is for agencies who are interested in NTD reporting. And so it's important that we understand those distinctions. And I think that's a great kind of lesson that you've given on terms of what the benefits is to acquiring and automating that process, which I think is great. So I kind of want to shift this into more of a consultative approach that you could maybe take when considering NTD validation and reporting. What would be your advice for an agency that is, acquiring an APC system for their fleet? What are some of the things that you would want to make sure they consider? I know you mentioned a couple before, but I'd like to kind of get a quick, brief bullet points on what you think is important.
In terms of acquiring an APC system, now I have to say that I'm no expert on APC systems or technology. Okay, So what I deal with mostly is how agents can best use the APC
Right.
data from the APC system that are, but I do have, I can answer that question from the perspective of some of the issues that agencies have encountered in trying
Please.
to use their APC data for NTD reporting. I think potential that can be helpful for agencies that are trying to acquire a APC system. Let me start with two minimum functionalities that their APC systems should have in relation to NTD reporting. Okay, one is that the APC system must be able to identify the raw APC data by all relevant identifiers for how it was scheduled and how it was operated. Basically very, very basic stuff. Of course, the dates and the schedule type, but that's easy. But the other ones, the timetable trips, the directions, all those things, the basic identifier must be in there. I've seen at least one system that don't have any of those identifiers. That's really necessary for the APC data to be useful. For example, if the raw APC data don't have, let's say, if you don't have the necessary identifiers to know that which set of your APC counts belong to a unique one-way vehicle trip you operated, for example, then really the data, the raw APC data really are useless essentially for any purpose, either internally or for NTD. Yeah, so those identifiers are essential. Now I know for most cases, those identifiers are there for most agencies.
Right.
Now, another thing I encountered in terms of for some of the agencies that the APC system has to be inclusive of all APC data for all services. Now, I'm not talking about, now, it's not a problem for the APC system to include APC data for the regular scheduled services. That's not a problem typically. What sometimes the APC system have problem is that they don't include unscheduled services. For example, for special events trips. Those don't occur all the time, but occasionally, and sometimes, they don't have a capability of somehow include them and processing such APC data. So you want to be inclusive. Now, in terms of procuring an APC system, agencies might want to consider the following as part of their procurement process. One thing is very basic, again, is it should include a cleansing software, a piece of cleansing software that can process the raw APC data and generate balanced trips and the valid APC data for every balanced trip. Now I've seen APC data that APC systems don't have this capability at all, just the raw counts. That's right. And naturally, as a result, you cannot even get to the system to consider whether or not you can report passenger miles there because it's not balanced and no passenger loading, no passenger miles. So you definitely need that. And you need a reporting piece of reporting software that can take all the valid APC data generated by the cleansing software, I guess, and also all the trips you operated, and combine those two sources of data to generate what you need to report to APC, NTD. So the reporting software, at the minimum, need to take those two pieces of data and combine them to generate the NTD data. Now, without such a reporting software, it's oftentimes very burdensome for staff agency staff, for many agencies. It's often difficult. Now, for larger agencies, it may not be the problem, but for small agencies, it often is the problem. Now, vendors like DILAX maybe and some other APC agencies may not like this, but I think agencies should consider having the new APC system certified by FTA for NTD reporting as part of the procurement process. Now, I say this is because without this certification by FTA as part of the procurement process, it's not uncommon for an agency to take years for its AP system get ready for NTD reporting. There can be tons of issues, even though the original procurement process has a validation process by the vendor. You know, you compare 100 boarding and alighting activities, for example, to the manual data for the same activities, and see whether or not the AP system reached the 95% accuracy level, for example. But that does not guarantee that the system is necessary, can get FTA's certification. So that's something they should consider. But now there are some shortcomings of that because, for example, that might lengthen the procurement process as an outcome by including having the FTA certification as part of it. But you know, the agencies need to balance the cost, the benefit of the two. And I think the last piece is very important, and agencies oftentimes don't have it, is to have the effective monitoring and notifying process for problems, both for hardware and the data. That sometimes I've seen agencies have a bunch of APCs not providing even any raw data for months, not days. Nobody knew.
Right.
And no notifications and just no data at all. And that's bad. And that essentially is saying that you may have 100% coverage, physical coverage of your fleet, but the effective APC coverage is much lower than your 100% you thought you have. If you don't have such a monitoring and notification process to quickly repair your. So these are the things I thought I kind of observed from my interactions with some of the APC agencies.
No, and I appreciate that. That's exactly what we wanted in terms of an answer. We want the raw, the honest answer from data, qualified statistician's perspective. And I know this is going to be very valuable to agencies. So I appreciate you being very honest and open about what you think is the important requirements that should be considered. So thank you. I think that was a ton of great content. I'm going to start, these last two questions. I kind of want to open it up to a grander bird's eye view of everything, right? So, obviously a lot has changed in the last 20 years. APC is much more common. You're starting to see a lot more integration with technology on these buses. And so with more technology, obviously comes more data collection. There's a lot more systems that are on board a lot of these vehicles. Has that changed your work in any way over the years?
Well, yes. I mean, in terms of changes, yes, a lot have changed.
Right.
I looked at, APTA does
Yeah.
annual surveys of its members, not just about their ridership, but also about what they have on their buses, vehicles. Okay. So they have been doing this for years. Now, back around 20 years ago, less than 3% of the bus fleet of the responding member agencies had APCs. Okay, less than 3%, about 20 years ago. 20 years later, more than 60% of the entire bus fleet for the responding APTA member agencies. Now, so with 60%, so you can imagine that a lot of the agencies have 100% coverage or close to 100% coverage of the APC, because still there are some agencies that don't have any APC coverage. Okay, so overall, You can imagine that. So that's a lot. And certainly, counting technology of APCs improved, you mentioned. And the number of agencies that already are using and want to use APC data for NTD reporting has been exploding significantly in recent years. Now, that's partly, I think, is because APC FTA's policy towards using APC data for NTD reporting has changed. 20 years ago, only a few agencies were using APC data for NTD reporting. But back then, FTA had no policy, no requirements, separate policy, separate requirements on APC, on using APC data for NTD reporting. Now, starting in 2005, they implemented the first APC policy for report year 2005. That was very burdensome, requiring annual sampling, random sampling for a system certification. That was the effective through 2018. Now, starting in 2019, FTA implemented a new policy that is requires much lower burden on agencies. So I think that is the main reason why so many more agencies want to use the APC data for NTD reporting, large and small. Now, in terms of my work, through 2009, my NTD related work really focused mostly the traditional way of estimating data. That is through statistical sampling of vehicle trips and collecting sample data through manual ride checking.
Right.
And I did both research and certification for agencies. You mentioned at the very beginning, as part of my research, I developed manuals and corresponding templates for agencies to develop sampling plans that are customized to their conditions, so that they can take advantage of their unique conditions, so that they can minimize the amount of sampling they need while still meet NTD requirements. The old circular methods that a lot of agencies know and use require at least like 550 trips a year for bus services. And my research indicated way back that was way oversampling for most agencies. So my research at that time wanted to develop procedures and the tools for agencies to reduce their sampling burden. So that was through 2009. And FTA later adopted my second set of manual and sampling template to replace its old circulars. Now, starting in 2010, both my research and the certification work for agencies also tend to APC-related issues. And I developed two manuals related to using APC data for NTD reporting. One was kind of designed for the older APC policy by FTA, and the later one in 2019 was for the new FTA's APC policy. Now, in terms of certification work related to NTD APC for NTD reporting, I didn't really do much before 2019, except in one agency. They needed a bus rotation plan because the coverage was low. So they needed a rotation plan certified, a development certified for meeting the older policy for the agency at that time. But since the new policy and since 2019, I've been doing quite a bit work for agencies, particularly in terms of developing and certifying the method for them to expand they are all available validated data for, I've done that for bus, regular bus, rapid bus, which is bus rapid transit, and and then streetcar, light rail, and the commuter rail in the last few years.
Gotcha. And that's honestly you're definitely the person that has probably some great experience. I'm sure you have experience working with all types of vehicles for all these different agencies. So I don't want to go over time too much, but I definitely want to conclude with just one final question. Just based on everything that's happened in the last 20 30 years in terms of public transit, a lot has changed all over the country. Obviously there's tons of data being collected now more than ever. I kind of just want to more a loose perspective on kind of what you think is the future of public transit. Do you think it's heading in the right direction? Is it something what's the bright side of the data that's being collected from a statistician's perspective?
The future market for public transportation really largely is driven by societal forces. I mean, that's the majority, the main driver for future usage of public transportation in this country, at least. Really, it's societal forces that have driven down the demand for public transportation in this country, at least in the last, I don't know, 10 years, before the pandemic and through the pandemic. We don't really know beyond the current COVID pandemic how public transportation usage demand might recover or change in the future. Really, it's hard to tell. Now, beyond the societal forces that the agencies have no really control. Okay, now within their control, certainly they can take advantage the vast amount of data that the technologies they have equipped with their buses or other motor vehicles that they have in hand to do various things that kind of take advantage and try to design their services so that can best meet all the available potential demand given the societal forces that are outside their control, so that they can better design their services to extract all the potential demand that there is within the society.
Gotcha.
I'm not sure how much detail I can say, but I think these are the two things
I think that's great.
Yeah.
No, yeah, I think that's a great perspective. I mean, it really does. There's a lot of societal and cultural forces that influence how much public transit is used. But I think that's exactly what we're looking for in terms of a take. So thank you again. And with that, I think we're gonna conclude the talk today. Again, Dr. Chu, thank you for coming on. You definitely gave us a ton of good information, and hopefully that can impact some agency in the future. So with that being said, that concludes our Tech Talk for today. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more content in the coming weeks. We plan to be putting up some new talks in the future. But again, thank you, Dr. Chu, for joining us. I think we had a pretty productive conversation. We'll link your contact information at the end of the video as well for anybody who may want to get in contact with you. So again, thanks everybody for watching, and we'll see you guys next time.